Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking a really fascinating dive into the source material of a recent academic lecture on comparative Eastern theology. It proposes a totally unique and honestly kind of mind-blowing way to look at the evolution of religious thought. We're going to unpack all these complex ideas together, so let's get right into it.
Right off the bat, the lecture we're examining kicks off with this incredibly direct question. How do traditional religions and Daesun Jinriho actually differ? Now, whether you're deeply familiar with Eastern philosophy or you're just curious about how different belief systems categorize themselves, this sets the stage perfectly for an objective, academic exploration. It's not about which one is better, it's about understanding a fundamental shift in purpose.
Okay, let's dive into this core thesis. The speaker argues that the traditional purpose of religion has historically been all about seeking wisdom. But Daesun Jinriho, which is a relatively newer movement, positions itself differently. It sees itself not just as a seeker of wisdom, but as an engine for practical application. It's this massive transition from merely knowing how the universe works to actively doing something about it. So, here is our roadmap for today. We're going to cover humanity's journey toward wisdom, understanding heaven and earth, the shift from knowing to practice, the 12 stages of religious growth, and finally, the era of adulthood. Starting off with Section 1, Humanity's Journey Toward Wisdom. The speaker notes that since the dawn of time, our universal human pursuit has essentially been a search for fundamental wisdom, mostly to avoid misfortune, right? And in Eastern philosophy, that wisdom starts right here, with yin and yang. True wisdom begins with recognizing this fundamental binary. Basically, everything in the universe, including fortune and disaster, which is referred to as kilhyonghuabok, travels together. They're a package deal. You just don't get one without the potential for the other. Now, what's truly fascinating here is how practical this ancient concept actually is. Understanding yin and yang helps humanity navigate the inevitable rise and fall of both individuals and entire nations. It helps explain those sudden, out-of-nowhere life crises, referred to as the three disasters. So, true wisdom, according to this framework, isn't just about celebrating good luck. It's about stoically accepting misfortune, knowing that it's often the direct precursor to fortune. That right there is the foundational goal of traditional wisdom. Moving on to Section 2, Understanding Heaven and Earth. So, if understanding yin and yang is the baseline, what was the ultimate goal for the great religious traditions of the past? The lecture uses a very specific historical term for this, Sangdong Chenmun. To translate this pretty dense Hanja concept, it essentially means perfectly understanding the profound astronomical mysteries of heaven. For traditional religions, reaching a state where you could connect with the divine secrets of the cosmos, that was seen as the absolute peak of intellectual and spiritual achievement. But, heaven is only half the equation. The counterpart to that is Habal Juri, understanding the foundational principles and geography of Earth. The source text explains that when a spiritual seeker masters both heaven and earth, they achieve a state called Sintong. This translates roughly to a divine connection. But, and this is absolutely crucial, it is described as a passive knowing. You know the deepest secrets of the universe, sure, but you are essentially just an observer. Which brings us to Section 3, From Knowing to Practice. This is where we see a fundamental shift. And this brilliantly illustrates the core difference we brought up at the start. Traditional religion focused heavily on understanding the mechanics of heaven and earth, but the focus of Daesun Jinriho, it takes that immense universal knowledge and forcefully applies it directly to human affairs. The technical term used in the lecture for this shift is Jungchol Insa. This is a pivotal game-changing concept. It represents a massive move away from Sintong, that passive divine knowing we just talked about, over to something called Dotong, which implies a practical real-world capability. Think of it like this. It's the difference between knowing exactly how a car's combustion engine works versus actually getting behind the wheel and driving that car somewhere meaningful. The speaker encapsulates this beautifully with the phrase Jihae Yongnyeok. Basically, wisdom alone simply isn't enough anymore. To truly evolve, one must possess not just the knowledge, but the supreme capability, the energy, and the courage, that's the Yongnyeok, to execute that wisdom in the real world to actually solve human problems. That takes us to Section 4, the 12 stages of religious growth. So you might be wondering, how does a theology explain such a massive shift in human spiritual evolution? Well, the speaker introduces this genuinely brilliant analogy, the 12 stages of life in Eastern philosophy.
It maps a biological timeline perfectly onto the evolution of religious thought. We start with Poti, which is conception. Then we move to Yangsang, meaning nurturing or gestation. Eventually we reach Guanwang, which is adulthood. And finally Sobyongsa, or decline and death. The lecture actually maps historical religions directly onto these human developmental phases.
Visually, it maps out a bit like this. Taoism is categorized as conception, providing that very first formless spark of universal creation. Buddhism is nurturing, forming the shape, the inner mind, and the physical form. Then, Confucianism represents childhood, that crucial stage where humanity is taught the strict rules, etiquette, and social order required to function. According to this framework, these were all absolutely necessary developmental phases of humanity's spiritual maturation.
And finally, Section 5, the era of adulthood, or Guanwang. So if humanity has gone through conception, gestation, and childhood, where are we right now? Well, according to this philosophy, humanity has graduated. We have officially left childhood behind and entered Guanwang, the era of the adult. We are no longer kids who need to be told the rules of the universe. We're adults, and now we're expected to step up and take on real responsibility. The crucial point here is that Daesun Jinriho is not described in this lecture as just some random, hybridized mix of older religions. Instead, it's positioned as that mature, adult stage. Think about it. An adult naturally integrates all the past lessons from conception, nurturing, and childhood rules, but then moves way beyond passive learning. An adult takes active responsibility and focuses entirely on building the future, which in this philosophy is called huchan, rather than just dwelling on the past. To really hammer home exactly how active this adult stage is, the lecture introduces this incredibly intense phrase, Sangak Chong Wan Hasup Jigi. This translates to actively grasping heaven's power and physically gathering Earth's energy for practical use. Contrast that with the passive, observant understanding of traditional religions we discussed earlier. This is literally roll-up-your-sleeves, world-building stuff. So pulling this all together, we can see the whole philosophical framework right here. The progression goes from the initial spark of Taoism to the inner nurturing of Buddhism, through the social conditioning of Confucianism, and culminates in the adulthood phase of Daesun Jinriho. And what's the ultimate goal there? Zhengchal Inza, the active, practical application of all that accumulated wisdom. Now, it's really important to remember that this is an academic interpretation. Scholars like Choi Won-hook, who focuses on the cyclical frameworks of Eastern thought, use these exact comparative paradigms to provide a structured lens for us. It allows us to view the evolution of religious movements not as competing factions, but as a continuous maturing life cycle of human consciousness. Which leaves us with a truly fascinating thought to end on today. According to this framework, humanity's childhood is over. If we have spent thousands of years just learning the rules of the universe, what exactly are we going to build now that we are expected to actively apply them as adults? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this journey helped clarify a truly complex, yet absolutely captivating subject for you.